So we've looked a little bit at the economic causes behind the Great Depression, and now we are going to look at how this disaster impacted the lives of normal Americans in the 1930s. So as you can see here, after 1929, the initial crash and the onset of the Great Depression, unemployment rose dramatically up to around 25%, where it peaked in 1933. Which meant, that a quarter of working Americans were unemployed, which had a huge impact on them and their families. Women during the Great Depression, in several ways, I guess their status took a bit of a backward step. By the end of the Great Depression, lots of women were actually working again due to this New Deal program that we'll talk about soon. But initially, their jobs and their new skills that they'd acquired in the wake of World War One, their jobs were sort of taken back by men who felt, I guess, in lots of ways they had priority to those jobs, and women found themselves competing for work with men, which was often a losing battle, and females often were the first to get either their wages cut or to get retrenched from their jobs. Many women lost their jobs as domestic servants, maids and housekeepers, because people just couldn't afford these luxuries anymore. And so a lot of that domestic work was actually lost. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady, the wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, she was a strong female figure and did a lot to gain rights and prestige for women during this tough time. Another group that experienced hardship was the African Americans. Again, they were often the first to get their wages cut and the first to be discriminated against because of the agricultural industry. That was very hard hit. That's where a lot of African Americans had their work in the South. As sharecroppers and contracted farmers and labourers, and so they often lost their jobs very quickly. And even in the North, 50% of them were actually unemployed in New York. During the Great Depression, hundreds and thousands of Mexican Americans were deported back to Mexico because it was seen that they were taking the jobs that were desperately needed by the Americans. And so I guess it was all the people that were the minorities, I guess women to a certain extent, but African Americans and, Mexican Americans and Native Americans were always given less priority to the Americans in terms of work. And so they were sent back to Mexico, and those jobs that the Mexicans did have during the good times were given back to the Americans, or the white Americans. When the Great Depression struck, there was almost 200,000 Native Americans living on reservations in dire poverty. There's a lot of famous Great Depression photography by photographers such as Dorothea Lange, and the common sentiment shared by people, in these really struggling communities was that the government isn't looking after us, and the president doesn't actually know and doesn't see what's happening to us out here. And they were getting very frustrated that they weren't getting any help or any relief. And so it was very common to see families packed up in their wagons and heading west to California, for example, to look for work and to try and find that promised land where there was some opportunity for them during the 1930s. And lots of people learnt their lesson. From all of those causes of the Great Depression, they learnt, for example, not to buy things unless you could afford it, and avoiding buying on credit. And they learnt to focus more on not making money but saving money. People learnt a lot of valuable lessons about the value of money, I guess. So these are common scenes, squatters' camps along the highways, and families that just basically have all their possessions on the back of a wagon, those that could afford a car. Otherwise, they'd be sort of walking along the highways. And so I guess you could call these people economic refugees, or people that were trying to find opportunity where there actually was none. And here you can see, famous photos that have stood the test of time about destitute, poor families struggling to find their way out of this Great Depression. Another incident or another event, catastrophe that compounded the pinch that people were feeling was the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl was an environmental disaster that hit the American Midwest between 1930 and 1940. It was basically a 9-year drought where lots of vegetation died, there was soil erosion, and due to storms, that very quickly turned to a major environmental disaster. So it basically turned into a huge dust storm, which has become known as the Dust Bowl. And here you can see just how far the extent of this actually went, all through central United States. Basically, the worst of this was in 1935, where 300 tons of soil was displaced up into the air in a giant dust storm, which travelled several thousand kilometres. And this became America's largest environmental disaster ever. Dust pneumonia killed thousands of people and left 500,000 people homeless, and they became environmental refugees. So we've got economic refugees, environmental refugees, but it caused huge shifts in where people were living around the United States, and a huge disruption to people's lives. So just when those 30-odd% of people in America, the farmers, were experiencing hardships, this came along and compounded those issues that they were experiencing. Millions of acres of land was destroyed, and this is what the landscape looked like after some of those worst parts of that Dust Bowl. And so there were refugee camps all around the United States for people escaping the Dust Bowl. And over the next 7 years, 220 million trees were planted to prevent a similar occurrence, because by planting trees, the roots would hopefully hold the ground together, and in times of drought, all that topsoil wouldn't blow away in these dust storms that had been experienced in the 1930s. And so through these photos, you can sort of sense the desperation and the hopelessness of the American people, and they were all sort of crying out for somebody to help them. And so when we focus next on the New Deal, we'll be able to see certain measures that the US government took in trying to pull the American people out of the Great Depression.